13.2 Planned Stakeholder Engagement. Planned stakeholder engagement is a process of developing approaches to involve project stakeholders based on their needs, expectations, interests and potential impact on the project. The key benefit is that it provides an actionable plan to interact effectively with stakeholders. This process is performed periodically throughout the project as needed, and that's on the PMBOK Guide, page 516. In this process, we are planning stakeholder engagement. But who are the stakeholders? According to the PMBOK Guide, a stakeholder is an individual, group or organisation that may be affected by or perceive itself to be affected by a decision, activity or outcome of the project, programme or portfolio. And so this will include managers, technical experts, the project manager, the project team, other departments in the organisation, sellers, buyers, customers, contractors, external agencies and so on. But what does engage mean? The Oxford Dictionary tells us that from our perspective it means establish a meaningful contact or connection with. And from the point of view of the stakeholder it means participate or become involved in. And so in this process we are planning how we will establish a meaningful contact or connection with all of these people who may be affected by or perceive themselves to be affected by some part of the project so that they can actively participate in or become involved in the work of the project. I'm sure you can realise that the information needs of the project stakeholders and the type and level of engagement that this diverse group requires will be different. If we hope to create an effective plan, we need to recognise this diversity, plan how to address the various needs very early in the project, and then we need to maintain the list so that it remains current. The first version of the stakeholder engagement plan is developed after the initial stakeholder community has been identified by the Identify Stakeholder process and is reviewed and updated regularly as the stakeholder community changes. Typical trigger situations requiring updates to the stakeholder engagement plan include when it is the start of a new phase of a project. Unfortunately, PMBOK Guide uses the word phase for two completely different purposes, and it's not always clear which one they mean. In this case, it could mean the start of a new stage of the project, or it could mean when you begin a phase, meaning a mini project within the main project. And when there are changes to the organisation structure or within the industry, when new individuals or groups become stakeholders, you will need to actively engage them. This is usually easier in later stages of the project because you already have an established stakeholder community to assist with their induction. When current stakeholders are no longer part of a stakeholder community, if a stakeholder is no longer part of the project, then he should be removed from the stakeholder engagement plan and the communications plan because people often get annoyed if they keep receiving emails, updates and meeting invitations from a project that they're no longer involved with and no longer interested in. But it can go deeper than this, as there may be a security aspect. I mentioned before that it's worth repeating. I was called to do an audit in a project some years ago, and I found a number of security issues. For example, several contractors had been hired for the first few months and they were given login access to the computers. This was standard practice. However, the project was now in its fourth year and I discovered that the contractor's login access had never been removed, that it had left 3.5 years ago. The plan was full of errors, but the biggest one I discovered was that a manager who had been a key stakeholder when the communications plan had been created had left the company in the project's first month and had gone to work for a competitor. This was not seen as an issue at the time because the project was still in planning and he hadn't been involved much. But I discovered that he was still on the communications plan, and on the plan all reports and minutes were directed to his personal email account, i.e. not his corporate account, which had been discontinued when he left. And this still astounds me. He had never been removed from the plan or the email group list, which means that a senior management with a competing organisation had been receiving all communications about the project for 4 years. And guess what? The competing organisation released a similar product to the market. Legal action was planned for IP theft, but the lawyers advised that the manager had never signed a non-disclosure agreement. But worse than that, the lawyers said the court's view would be that he hadn't stolen the information, he had been given the information. Please keep checking your communications plan and your stakeholder engagement plan to keep them up to date. Other triggers for reviewing the stakeholder engagement plan would include the importance of particular stakeholders to the project's success changes, and when outputs of other project process areas such as change management, risk management or issue management require a review of the stakeholders engagement strategies. The results of these adjustments may be changes to the relative importance of the stakeholders who have been identified. Planned stakeholder engagement inputs. Input number 1, the project charter. The project charter contains information on the project purpose, objectives and success criteria that can be taken into consideration when planning how to engage stakeholders. Input number 2, the project management plan. The components would be resource management plan, which may contain information regarding roles and responsibilities of the team and other stakeholders listed on the stakeholder register. When planning engagement, you can use a technique similar to that used in risk management. On a large project where you're managing hundreds or thousands of risks, it would be too time-consuming to attempt to manage each risk individually, and so you group the risks into categories. Similarly with stakeholders, you can allocate them to groups and then focus on the engagement method for each group rather than each individual within the group. Communication management plan. Strategies for stakeholder management and their implementation plans are both inputs to and recipients of information from processes in project stakeholder management. The risk management plan. This may contain risk thresholds or risk attitudes that can assist in selection of the optimal stakeholder engagement strategy mix. Input number 3, project documents. This would include the assumption log, because that would have information about assumptions and constraints that may be linked to specific stakeholders. The change log, that contains changes to the original scope of the project, usually links to specific stakeholders because they fall into the categories of requesting certain changes, making decisions about change requests, or being impacted by the implementation of approved change. Issue log. Managing and resolving issues contained in the issue log will require additional communications with the stakeholders affected. The project schedule. This may be linked to specific stakeholders as owners or executors or executors, however you like to pronounce it. The risk register, because it identified risks of the project and usually links them to specific stakeholders as either risk owners or subject to risk impact. Stakeholder register provides a list of project stakeholders that you will need to engage with, and it includes additional classification data and other information. Input number 4, agreements. Your organization's procurement or contracting group will be managing stakeholder engagement with contractors and suppliers on a daily basis, and so these existing channels can be leveraged for your project. I've found in many projects that the rapport already built up can enable problems and underperformance issues to be dealt with very quickly and, importantly, very amicably as well. Input number 5, enterprise environmental factors, will be the organization's culture, political climate and governance framework, the personnel administration policies, stakeholder risk appetites, established communication channels, global, regional or local trends, practices or habits, and geographical distribution of facilities and resources. Input number 6, organizational process assets, with the corporate policies and procedures for social media, ethics and security, corporate policies and procedures for risk, change issues and data management, organizational communications requirements, standardized guidelines for development, exchange, storage and retrieval of information, and a lot of that is protected and legislated by law. Lessons learned repository with information about the preferences, actions and involvement of the stakeholders for use on future projects, and software tools needed to support effective stakeholder engagement. Planned stakeholder engagement tools and techniques. No surprise, the tools and techniques number 1 is expert judgment. Expertise should be considered from individuals or groups with specialized knowledge or training in the following topics: politics and power structures in the organization and outside the organization, environment and culture of the organization and outside the organization, analytical and assessment techniques to be used for stakeholder engagement processes, communication means and strategies, and knowledge from previous projects of the characteristics of stakeholders and stakeholder groups, and organizations involved in the current project that might have been involved in previous similar projects. Some of this seems straightforward, but it isn't, especially with senior managers or senior technical experts, and that's why you need expert help. Many senior managers or senior technical experts act like gods or spoiled children. That's the same thing. I've had senior technical experts literally walk off the job for the most minor of issues. I had one very senior technical expert walked off the job because I provided him and another senior technical expert with phones for use. These were the landline phones, and he walked off because the phone I'd given to the other senior technical expert had more buttons than his phone had. Okay, in one organization, one of the senior managers had a very long and complicated title, and he had instructed his personal assistant to delete all emails to him that had the slightest error in his title. So many senior managers and senior technical experts need a lot of careful handling at times. Tools and techniques number 2, data gathering. A data gathering technique that can be used for this process is benchmarking. People often mistakenly think benchmarking just means measuring. Benchmarking includes measuring, but is primarily focused on comparing similar systems. It's best to compare your stakeholder engagement plan with other organizations if you can, rather than just to other projects in your own organization. Otherwise your results will be biased and you will be unable to detect common errors across the projects. The PMBOK guide says the results of stakeholder analysis are compared with information from other organizations or other projects that are considered to be world class. But as your organization is probably a competitor of these organizations, it's hard to imagine why they would receive you with open arms to look at their systems of how they operate. However, please remember that for the exam, the PMBOK guide is always right. Tools and techniques number 3, data analysis. Techniques that can be used for this process include assumption and constraint analysis. Analysis of current assumptions and constraints may be conducted in order to tailor appropriate engagement strategies. For example, you may develop assumptions about the communications technology that will be acceptable for certain groups, and that a secretary will be provided for each meeting for recording the minutes. Constraints may be that you can't hold meetings before 10 a.m. on Monday mornings or after 3 p.m. on Fridays. Root cause analysis. Root cause analysis identifies underlying reasons for the level of support of project stakeholders in order to select the appropriate strategy to improve their level of engagement. And of course, if this was an exam question, you'd be expecting an answer to include fishbone, Ishikawa, YY or cause and effect diagrams. Tools and techniques number 4, decision making. Decision making techniques that can be used for this process include prioritization and ranking. Stakeholder engagement need to be prioritized and ranked, as do the stakeholders themselves. Stakeholders with the most interest and the highest influence are often prioritized to the top of the list, and I find the following power interest grid to be very useful for this purpose. If a stakeholder has high power and high interest, manage closely. High power and low interest, keep satisfied. Low power and high interest, keep informed. Low power and low interest, just monitor. Please remember not to use people's names in these lists, otherwise you can get into a lot of bother if someone gets hold of it and they complain about how they've been categorized. Tools and techniques number 5, data representation. Techniques that may be used in this process include mind mapping, which is where you can visually organize information about stakeholders and their relationships to each other and the organization. This example is from www.xmind.net. Stakeholder engagement assessment matrix. A stakeholder assessment matrix supports comparison between the current engagement levels of stakeholders and the desired engagement levels required for successful project delivery. One way to classify the engagement level of stakeholders is shown in figure 13.6. The engagement level of stakeholders can be classified as follows: unaware of the project and potential impacts; resistant, unaware of the project and potential impacts, but resistant to any changes that may occur as a result of the work or outcomes of the project. These stakeholders will be unsupportive of the work or outcomes of the project. Neutral, unaware of the project, but neither supportive nor unsupportive. Supportive, aware of the project and potential impacts and supportive of the work and its outcomes. Leading, aware of the project and potential impacts and actively engaged in ensuring that the project is a success, and quite often the project sponsors in that last category. In figure 13.6, C represents the current engagement level for each stakeholder and D indicates the level that the project team has assessed as essential to ensure project success. Desired, in other words. The gap between current and desired for each stakeholder will direct the level of communication necessary to effectively engage a stakeholder. When managing stakeholder engagement, you will need to work on closing the gap between current and desired. Tools and techniques number 6, meetings. Meetings are used to discuss and analyze the input data of the stakeholder engagement planning process and to develop a sound stakeholder engagement plan. Stakeholder engagement outputs. Output number 1, stakeholder engagement plan. This is a component of the project management plan. It identifies the strategies and actions required to promote productive involvement of stakeholders in decision making and execution. It can range from very simple to complex depending upon the requirements of the organization, the project and the stakeholders. The PMBOK guide is not prescriptive. The stakeholder engagement plan may include specific strategies or approaches for engaging with individuals or groups of stakeholders. This brings us to the end of planned stakeholder engagement. Next lesson is 13.3, manage stakeholder engagement. Please read the corresponding chapter to the PMBOK guide before watching the video so that you can remain engaged.